Hi everyone, welcome to THT, and today we're going to take a look at the metagame of Spark of Rebellion. It is a Sunday night and I just managed to win my first store showdown. So that was a great experience, and yeah, and if you want to know everything, I won with my hand green. Now back to the video. I wanted to take a step back and take a look more globally at the meta and see how we can use that information to kind of better prepare. Because right now, of course, the meta is extremely diverse. There's tons of different decks that you're going to be playing against, and especially for someone who is not too familiar with the meta and wants to prepare for a tournament, it can be a little bit overwhelming to not know again what to prepare against because there's just so many different decks that do very different things. So what we're going to do in this video is that we're going to be classifying the different decks in different categories depending on uh, what are the global things that we can do. And then on the second part, we're going to be classifying those decks into all um, I would say how likely you're going to be encountering those decks during tournaments, and therefore how much should you prioritize playtesting against those specific decks. So this is my very subjective meta overview. So here's the different deck that I've decided to include. First of all, so there's 5 different categories. These the true aggro decks on top. Then we got the tempo decks, the tempo mid-range decks, so pretty aggressive decks, but not as but still has some level of interaction with the opponent. They do play a certain amount of removal, but they still are primary aggressive decks. Then we got ramp mid-range decks, so mid-range deck that are going to be more based on trying to overwhelm you with ramp and very big threats, but still are relatively aggressive and are going to be trying to kill you relatively quickly. And then there are the ramp control decks that are also trying to use the ramp and can play very big units to try to win the game, and they can win the game relatively quickly, but they have a much denser amount of removal in those decks, and also ways to heal and basically control mechanics. And then at the end, they are a category of deck that a few months ago did not even exist. The hard control deck, the deck that are really completely defensive and really trying to either win the game with when you're completely exhausted or by milling you with vigilance. So much more, way more hard control decks. So the classification also from left to right is also so on the left they're the most aggressive decks, and on the right the least aggressive decks. So we're gonna go over those different decks one by one. First, in the aggro category, we got the most aggressive deck in the meta, in my opinion, is Leia Red. Leia Red, I think, is the most aggressive because it's really the deck that if you decide to not interact with it, it's the deck that will kill you faster, the fastest. Sabine is not. I know it's can be a little bit counterintuitive for some people, but I think Sabine is a little bit less aggressive in the sense that Sabine has more ways to deal you damage out of hand using her ability, notably. But she doesn't have the same ability to just kill you in such a speed and such a fast speed like Leia can, thanks to her accent cheating ability. So I feel like Leia deck felt a bit more aggressive to me than the Sabine decks in general. And then you got I think Sabine Cunning, which is the most aggressive because of Surprise Strike and Falcon. Sabine Green a little bit less aggressive because it can interact a little bit with a lot of people play Zeb and also like Energy Conversion Lab. And then Sabine Red, which is a little bit less aggressive because once again it uses aggression as a way to interact with the opponent. Then we got our tempo decks. Obviously, the quintessential tempo decks is Boba Yellow, which is fairly aggressive but doesn't have the same kind of aggression that Sabine has. Doesn't have ways to deal direct damage. And is relatively interactive. Has quite a few ways to bounce the opponent units and a lot of tempo tools to tempo you out. Also aggressive in a different way and red. So unread in that category of tempo mid-range deck, but depending on the version, it could be also considered an aggro deck or even a ramp mid-range deck, depending on what version you're playing. So I decided to kind of go in between. And then we got the Shirut, Luke, once again, a lot of different ways to build this deck, but I think the most popular versions have been fairly aggressive, trying to capitalize on a 2-drops and then a wing leader or a wing leader, and I forgot the name, fleet lieutenant, and then trying to really put pressure on the opponent, and then but once again a little bit more on the mid range. Really, Shirut is really at the frontier between mid rangey and tempo. I think it's more aggressive than Boba Green, so it's really at the frontier between the two. Then we got the ramp mid range. The most aggressive of them is obviously Boba Green. Quite quite versatile. It does have access to Fed Fire Spray, so it can decide to be aggressive or defensive depending on the situation. Then we got Grand Inquisitor Green, which is basically the ramp version of Grand Inquisitor. Then we got Luke Green, which can ramp with either resupply and also a displacer. Hand Blue, then Hand Green, a little bit more defensive. I think Hand Green has like a slightly better late game than Hand Blue has. That's why I put it a bit more on the right. And then the ramp control decks, you got the least controlly of them is the Cunning version. Then you got the Vader Green or Palpatine Red are almost the same deck. There's just a few card differences. So when there are decks that are just so similar to one another, I basically merge them together on the same cell and just merge them together. Same for the Krennic / Iden Green, a bit more controlly, and then the Palpatine Blue, which is basically a bit more, once again, a little bit more controlly. And then you got the out control. So here a little bit controversial. I decided to place Boba Blue in the hard control category, even though it's a deck that can kill quite fast because it has access to Fire Spray. But it's still a plan B. It's a weird. It's a little bit difficult to classify because it really depends on the draw that it has. But from my experience and from playing against it and with it, it is more a control deck than it is a mid-range deck. So it is by far the most aggressive of the art control decks, but it is still, in my opinion, as the same tool as the control deck. Still plays the Entrench, still plays the Super Laser Blast, and so on. So then we got the Vader, Iden Red, and then we got the Thrawn Blue, and then the most controlly, the most passive is Iden Blue by far. So this is kind of my classifications. And basically, I think that whenever you are designing your sideboard, you kind of want to basically cover those different decks and think about those different kind of decks and kind of think about how you want to play against those type of decks. So this classification is kind of like inspired, has been inspired by, I think Wu was the first one who basically split this in 5 different categories. Maybe there are the other ones who did that as well, but yeah, I think this is the most accurate way to represent the meta. Is the separation between those 5 is relatively clear, even though there's some blurry line. For example, Han Green can look very similar to a Palpatine Yellow. Same, Palpatine Blue can behave relatively similarly to a Boba Blue as well. So it's a bit blurry, but you get the idea of the progression from most aggressive to least aggressive. And this is going to give you an overview of what you can expect whenever you're facing those decks, and also what kind of different categories of deck you need to kind of think about whenever you're building your decks. So my next slide is more based on the tier. So basically when people talk about tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, it is not a classification of power level, because it's not necessarily because you're playing a tier 1 deck that you have more chance of winning the tournament than if you're playing a tier 2 deck. It's not a classification of power level, it is a classification of how often you're going to be encountering those decks. So sometimes how popular the deck is related to how powerful it is. So sometimes there is a correlation between being a tier 1 and being the best deck, but that's not always the case. Sometimes there are decks that don't see a lot of play that are very powerful and that are gonna go up in the tiers. They're gonna become more and more popular. I think that was a very good example of this for Hand Green. So when the game first released, Hand Green was considered a tier 3 deck, and then as people started figuring out the deck and the deck became more popular, it went up and up and up. And there's some decks which were not even considered meta decks, like for example the Vader blue decks was not even considered meta before the release of the game, and now is considered to be very much a meta deck. So don't see the tier list, the tier ranking as a ranking of quality, but and power level, but rather a ranking of how popular are those decks in tournament and how likely you are going to be encountering them. And basically this means that the higher this deck is in the list, the more you're gonna have to think about those decks when you're building your deck. Whenever you're building, you're gonna have to think about those decks, because those decks are going to be the ones that are going to be the most played. So first of all, we got Boba Green and Sabine Green, which were the two most, I think the two most popular and successful deck in Star Wars Unlimited so far. Sabine Green a little bit less so than Boba Green. Once again, there's a certain logic here in how I place those in the different tiers. And those decks, obviously, they are everywhere. They are always got the lion's share in terms of how well represented they are in tournaments, and therefore you need to very, very much prepare against them. Then in the tier 1.5, there are decks that are still very popular, but not as much as the tier 1. So you got Han Green, the Iden Red / Vader Blue, because they are almost the same deck, or which are the out control. So this you really want to have some sort of plan to deal with those decks. We get also the Iden / Krennic Green, which is still very popular, especially Krennic Green. I put those both in the same cell, but obviously Krennic Green is far more popular, but it's not by a lot. It's not so it's a deck that doesn't make a lot of noise, but has always been trusting top 8, top 16. Vader Red, so Vader Green, and Palpatine Red also. Especially Vader Green is pretty much in most top 8, top 16 tournaments. It always shows up and still does consistent results. And then finally we got Boba Yellow, which is a deck that I think was very successful when the game first released, and then has kind of lost a bit of its popularity. But I think this is not necessarily representative. I think Boba Yellow is still very much a deck that's going to see a lot of play. So you got to really keep it in mind. Then in tier 2 we got Iden Blue, Sabine Yellow, a bit less popular Luke Green, and then Chirrut Red, Boba Blue, which has recently really risen in popularity. Leia Red, which is still doesn't see as much play as the beginning of the game, but still does see a lot of play. Palpatine Blue, tier 2.5. Sabine Red, which has recently risen in popularity, even though it's still relatively niche. Palpatine Yellow, which you're gonna see every once in a while. Maybe some people would consider this to be tier 3. This can be discussed. And then definitely a lot more niche. Han Blue, Han Red, Thrawn Blue, and then finally Grand Inquisitor Green, which I think deserve to see a lot more play than what it has. I think Grand Inquisitor Green and Vader Green are very close in terms of power level, and yet you see there's a huge difference in how much they see play. And I think this is a little bit so as I said, this is not representative of a power level. It's how often you're going to see this play, and this kind of mental map can really help you understanding what you need to prioritize playing against. So what I encourage you to do is to go at home and do the same like little map and kind of map out in your area what are the most popular decks, and kind of classify them in one of those 5 categories. And that's going to give you an idea of what you need to prioritize against. Sometimes it helps to put this on paper, just like I did. So this is obviously my tier list is very much based on a very global idea of the meta. I try to follow as many tournament results as possible and try to see what people are playing and stuff like this. And it's kind of like my own little map out of the meta, but you can do your own, and this is going to help you once again have a better understanding of the meta and kind of understand what you need to side and play test against. So I hope this meta overview was useful for you guys, for people who are wondering what kind of deck you should kind of be preparing against, and also what sort of strategy you are thinking about countering between the five main big strategies that have been kind of identified in Star Wars Unlimited so far. Hopefully, we get a more diverse amount of strategies later on in the future with, for example, like all kinds of combo decks, control combo, aggro combo, pure combo, that kind of thing. That would be cool to have those decks make an appearance in the game at some point. But so far, this is what we have, and I think I speak for everybody to say that this is an extremely diverse meta. Every little, obviously, there are way more decks that see play in tournament other than those. Some people play Tarkin, some people play Chewbacca in tournament, but I don't consider those to be as competitive as those ones. So I obviously this is subjective. This is kind of my own list, but already if you take into account the deck that are on this tier list, there's already a massive diversity of different decks, and I think we are very blessed to be in an environment where right away from the first set of the game, there's a plethora of different leaders, a plethora of different colors, and a plethora of different strategy that we can use in this game, and I think that's great. Um, as usual, I got my coaching service are open I will put in the description below if you're interested in booking a session with me, so I can give you personalized help on your deck. Feel free to let me know on Discord, and I'll put all the rules and the schedule on the description below. With all that being said, I'll see you next time, guys. Bye bye.